Hey guys, James saying. So today's video will be about blood draw. So if you're a nurse or a person who has to draw blood at your hospital or wherever you work, this is an effort to minimize your redraws, increase patient satisfaction so they don't have to be stuck more than once, and make your life, day-to-day life easier so that you have you don't have to redraw the blood. So my name is James. I'm a nurse. I've been a nurse for about 40 years. I've worked various intensive care. And today we also have Nicole.
I'm a medical laboratory scientist. I work in the lab running all the blood and other body fluids that you could potentially get taken out of your body.
So you're the person who would call and say, you got to send a recollect.
I am.
All right, so there's a number of reasons that people can have a recollect. And one is there is an order of draw. If you're drawing multiple tubes of blood, I don't have them all committed to memory, but I'll post on here. So you'll get your blood cultures first, and then a blue top, red top, gold top, light green, dark green, purple, gray, yellow. So that's a lot. Now I don't work in a hospital where I have to draw my own blood. Fortunately, there's a lot of hospitals that are going to that business model, which I think is a mistake because phlebotomists are better than most people at drawing blood because it's what they do. I get a lot of pre-op patients, and if they did not have their blood drawn before they got to me, I start their IV. When I start their IV, with an extension tubing that has air in it. I use a waste tube, I use a vacutainer, I get the air out of the extension tubing, and then I start my blood draw. So there is an order. For me, it's easy because I'm typically drawing blue tops, green tops, and purple or lavender. So I just remember the alphabet. B comes first, G comes next for green, and whether it's purple or L for lavender. So I'm drawing blue, green, purple. But I'll put up a list of the order of draw because you may be drawing something more than a blue, green, and a purple. Why is there an order of draw?
Well, most of these tubes have some kind of anticoagulant or preservative or any kind of fluid in it. And we don't want any kind of cross-contamination between the tubes.
So if you had cross-contamination, that could give you erroneous results.
Yeah.
I'll tell you one common mistake that happened to me when I started working in an area where I got pre-op patients. Like, for example, I never knew that the blue top, I call it the invisible line because there's a line near the top of the blue top that's the same color of the tube.
Yep.
The blood has to be to that line. I would get insufficient quantity. And then when somebody pointed out the invisible line, I could see it. So that was a common mistake that I would make when I first started drawing blood. I didn't have the blue top filled to the invisible blue line.
Right.
So I'm going to have you run through some of the common things we see. The blood is hemolyzed, and we'll talk about that and how some people have perhaps a misconception of hemolysis and clotting, drawing proximal to an IV or drawing through an IV line without wasting enough blood. This is I got from you. I didn't know people did this. They would take blood from one tube and put it into another, or people would have a clot that may be supposed to be there, not supposed to be. They would take the clot out of the tube. I've never actually opened up a tube. I didn't think you're supposed to open up tubes of blood. But tell me about this hemolysis versus clotting. People will call and say, you will call the nurse on the floor and say, it's hemolyzed, I need a redraw. And then what do they typically say?
A lot of times they say that when they sent it wasn't hemolyzed. Well,
so I don't think people understand the difference between hemolysis and clotting. So what is the difference?
So hemolysis is when the red blood cells, they burst open. So when we spin the blood down, we have two components, red blood cells and the water part, which is either the plasma or the serum, depending on what tube. And when those red blood cells, when they burst open, they actually turn the blood, like the water part of the blood, red. It should be a yellow, like a clear yellow, and it actually turned red.
So when a person that has drawn blood, you can't hold up a blue top or a purple top or a green top and say, there's hemolysis in there. You won't know until you spin it down, right?
Right. Right. So this is our profession. We do this every day for most of our lives. And I can tell you there is not one person in the lab that could look at a whole blood sample and tell you whether it's hemolyzed or not.
Touching back on hemolysis, that's the breaking down of the red blood cells, not the clotting. What are some things that can cause, from your experience, what are some, I can tell you from a nurse's point of view, is that if somebody's drawing blood with a syringe and they're pulling back forcefully on the syringe to get the blood, they're gonna get a call. The lab's gonna call 30 minutes later, say the blood's hemolyzed, gotta draw it again. I've seen it happen again and again. Are there any other things that can cause hemolysis?
One of the most common ones we see is if the tourniquet is left on too long. So it really shouldn't be left on for more than a minute. Ideally, even less than that.
Okay, so a tourniquet being on left too long causes hemolysis. A forceful drawing back. What if sometimes from my point of view, I see people and it's like they're having a difficult time getting blood from the vein. It's dripping in. It's either up against a valve, it's up against the wall. What if it's just taking a long time to fill the tube?
Well, that's no good either. One, if it's coming too slow, there's a good possibility it's breaking apart while it's coming. And you're not getting that blood into the tube fast enough so that it'll mix with the anticoagulant. And so we want that mixing to happen as quickly as possible so that we can avoid any potential clots that might happen.
Okay, so you bring up a good point of mixing the tubes. So there are some tubes that have absolutely nothing in them, and like a waste tube has nothing in it. But most tubes have something, and you have to mix the blood with the agent. So, like I said earlier, a blue top should really not clot for days and days, but when I started drawing blood from my pre-op patients, I have to literally invert it 8 times. So I mean that's 1, 2.
Yep.
So if you don't invert it, then it won't mix with the chemicals in the tube, and it either will clot when it's not supposed to, or it won't clot when it is supposed to. So do you see that a lot? You think you have tubes that are not, the blood was never really mixed?
Absolutely, because I've seen this before, especially with, well, not especially, but sometimes with newer phlebotomists when they're learning, they draw the blood and then they just put it on the table. Or nurses might do the same thing, draw the blood, throw it on the bed. You have to take that time to invert it because, like you said, we want to make sure that we mix it all really well so that every part of the blood mixes with that anticoagulant to avoid any potential clot formation that could happen.
Now, sometimes you tell me some stories where somebody comes back and, you know, the sodium's 800, or they come back and the potassium. There's just unbelievable, and it's typically related to an IV. And I can tell you from a nursing perspective, if a patient has an IV here, veins return blood to the heart, and you draw proximal or you draw above the IV site, well, you're getting obviously some blood, but you're getting IV fluid. It just depends what kind of IV fluid. Like you were telling a story the other day about somebody, they must have been getting TPN, total parental nutrition. So you just get unbelievable.
Yeah, I think if I remember correctly, glucose is like 1400, and they normally run, call it 160.
Yeah, so you're calling and saying, hey, is your patient in a coma?
Pretty much.
Because their glucose 1400.
Yeah.
No. Okay, so you can't draw. You can't draw from immediately above or proximal to your IV where your IV is infusing because you're going to get blood mixed with the IV. You were telling some stories. It never even crossed my mind that anybody would take the top off a tube because it's a vacuum sealed tube. Like when I put blood in a tube, I use a vacutainer. I don't usually use a syringe, but the few times I have used a syringe with a needle, I put it in the tube. It has a vacuum to it. It will pull out the blood in the amount that it needs in the forceful or not forceful manner that it requires. But you're telling me people take the tops off the tube.
Yeah, I think if I were to guess, I think what maybe people might be thinking is, okay, I drew all my blood from a syringe. I have a 10 cc syringe. And if I just take the top off and squirt it in real fast, it's a lot faster than putting putting it on the tube and just waiting for it to fill and then going to the next one, waiting for it. I can just do it real fast. But that's not really the ideal way.
You've also told stories of people taking, like, one tube did not get full enough, so they took blood from a second tube, took blood that was in there out of that to make the other tube have enough blood.
Yeah.
Obviously, that causes a problem.
That causes a big problem, and we know it happens.
What are some of your what would be a big clue that?
Well, the most popular one we get is when somebody has a full purple top, which has K2 potassium. K2 is potassium, EDTA, an anticoagulant. And then they have a chemistry tube, and they're like, oh, shoot, I need more. So they pour from the purple top into the chemistry tube. Well, the purple top, you just poured the blood and more potassium into that chemistry tube. So we'll get results like a potassium of 14, greater than 14.
Yeah, something incompatible with life.
It's not possible. My biggest suggestion is these tubes, like you said, are made to pull blood into them. You don't have to manipulate them at all. Just use the tube. Don't open it. Don't go into it. Don't pour from it. Just draw the blood in the tube and then invert it, of course, and set it aside. And then there's your tube. And if you happen to not get enough of the next one, just either maybe draw again, try again. It's going to save you time in the long run than, pouring it. And now you're going to have to draw everything again instead of maybe just the chemistry tube. Or if you didn't get a whole lot and you're not sure if it's going to be enough, send it. We can do a lot on a little bit of blood in most cases.
Yeah, so it's typically like the blue top has to be to a certain level, but the other tubes don't necessarily. Ideally, you want as much blood in the tube as you can, but I have done that myself where it's like I started an IV and it was just like petering out. It's like, well, the green top's not quite as full as I wanted it to be, but I sent it and I got results.
If you're ever in doubt about something, just call the lab. We want to all be on the same team. We don't want to have to call the nurses. We don't want the nurses to have to recollect. We know you have a lot more on your plate to worry about than to say, oh, the lab called again. We don't want to call you. We don't want you to have to recollect. We just want everything to go as smoothly as possible. So instead of doing something and finding out it's wrong later, ask and try to get it right the first time.
Okay, so excellent points. Any final thoughts?
I guess my big takeaways would be there's an order of draw. Try to stick with that. Always invert the tubes. Don't open the tubes. Don't take the clots out. Don't pour. Just kind of leave them as they lay. And if you have any issues or questions, call the lab. We're all on the same team. We just want the patients to be happy and healthy.
Okay. You just reminded me when you said call the lab, and that's great advice. Call the lab if you have any questions about anything. You said sometimes people will put a note like, this was a hard draw. Run it. Make sure you run it fast.
Yeah.
Because I think they're thinking it's going to clot if you don't run it. So if you've inverted your tubes, the blood that's not ever supposed to clot, it's not going to clot today. And the blood that is supposed to clot, you actually have some blood like a gold top. You have to wait for it to clot before you can run your test, right?
Yeah, in most cases, we have to let it sit for 30 minutes.
So there's golden. A lot of the lab tests, gold and green, there's different things that can be done, but a lot of the same tests can be done from a gold and a green, correct? And I'm always drawing green because I'm doing pre-op, patients having surgery sometime in the very near future, like within 30 minutes to an hour. And so I'm always running stat. So the green top's it's not supposed to clot. The gold top, if it's not an urgent or a stat, you've got to wait for it to clot.
Right.
Gotcha. All right, guys, so just to recap, there is an order of draw. Number 2, on the blue top, you have to get to the the invisible line, as I call it. Number 3, there is a big difference between hemolysis and clotting. Number 4, or the next point, some tubes the blood is supposed to clot, and some tubes the blood is never supposed to clot. Number 3, don't draw above the IV site. We have IV infusing because whatever's in the IV is going to be mixed with the blood and could potentially alter your results. If you are drawing from a line, check your institution if you are allowed to draw from a line, that you waste enough blood, and if you have any policy about returning the blood to the patient. None of this has to do with pediatrics. I don't do anything with pediatrics, neonates. This is all conversation about adults. You have to mix your blood tubes. You have to invert them about 8 times. Literally, you have to do that. Don't open up your blood tubes. Don't break the vacuum on them. Don't take blood from one tube and put it into another tube. Don't take any clots out of the tube. Just leave the tubes closed. All right, guys, thanks so much. If you like the video, hit the thumbs up. It would help my channel. And if you found the information helpful or useful, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you do, remember to turn on notifications so that you don't miss when the next video comes out. All right, guys, thanks so much. We'll see you in the next video.